I'll give you a thumbs up.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are the Bright Family Engagement Team. We are a division of the Bright Network. Bright stands for the Bridge for Resilient Youth in Transition. Bright developed schools programs that worked with schools and families to promote wellness and academic success for teens returning to school from prolonged absences. I'm going to take a quick moment to introduce our team. We have our family engagement specialist, Megan Harding. We have Lakeisha Wilson, Victor Bradley, Julie Patton, and myself, Sue Donofrio, and we are your Bright Family Engagement Coordinators. And we are very excited to introduce our guest speakers, which we will do in just a moment. Our team hosts these monthly speaker series on a variety of topics. And before we get started, I just want to let you know this is our last speaker series event for the school year. But if you have a topic that you would like us to cover, and even if you're watching this video as a recording, please click on the Google form here in the comments and complete it. And we have a raffle for a chance to win a $50 gift card. Our format tonight is a little different, that we'll introduce each panelist and have them share their wisdom with us. And then we're going to open this up for a dialogue, which we hope that you'll add to. Throughout our presentation, please add your comments or thoughts or questions in the chat in YouTube, and we'll be sure to include those. So we're happy to be here tonight. I'll pass it over to Julie to begin our introductions for tonight's topic, which is what your LGBTQ plus child needs from you.
Great. Our first panelist is Nicole Stefano, who was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. So she's from the West Coast and has lived in Bend, Oregon for the last 8 years with her partner and 4 kids. Nicole is currently a state board certified clinical social worker associate with Rimrock Trails Outpatient and sees clients through the lifespan with a focus on children and families. In addition to being a mental health psychotherapist, Nicole has worked in social service settings for over 20 years as a Head Start teacher, family advocate, family access network advocate, life coach for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, shelter resident monitor for teens experiencing homelessness, and intervention specialist for domestic violence offenders. Nicole provides a client-centered, family-focused relational approach to therapy using trauma-informed attachment, I'm going to mess this one up, MICBT, DBT, play, expressive, solution-focused, and structural family therapy modalities. So, Nicole, do you want to take it away?
I will. Thanks so much, Julie. That was great. It's always fun to hear all the things I've done over 20 years. Let me go ahead and start my screen share and bear with me. There we go. How's it looking? Good? All right. All right. So let me move things around here. Make sure that we can, postpone starting my laptop. There we go. All right. And let me back up just a few. There we go. Okay, let's start with what your queer child most needs to hear from you. So, hi all, I'm so pleased to be with you and talk to you today about this important issue. As you know, I'm Nicole Stefano, and I'm a clinical social work associate in Bend, Oregon. And I chose to use the term queer today because it's a lot easier to say than LGBTQIA++. So I'm just going to go with that. And queer is a term that denotes or relates to a sexual or gender identity that does not correspond to established ideas of sexuality and gender, especially heterosexual norms. Our conversation today is meant to be more one of curiosity and to open additional conversations on this topic. So I thought a good place to begin would be to talk about the stigma and history around identifying as queer. In general, stigma around receiving mental health support appears to be diminishing, especially in light of shared traumatic events with COVID And as we see more celebrities and athletes bringing awareness around the issue, there's increasing awareness and acceptance of the relationship between mental health and physical health. And it's less often viewed as a negative attribute or shortcoming to receive mental health support. Also, there is a lot more research and understanding around the relationship between chronic stress and trauma and the impact on brain development. With regards to the queer community, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, the DSM that we use to diagnose people when they come into our office, that underwent a change in 1973 by removing homosexuality from the list of disorders as more research and theories regarding sexuality were published. Thereby creating a really important shift from asking questions about what causes homosexuality and how can we treat it to focusing instead on the health and mental health needs of queer populations. Currently, the DSM lists gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, which refers to psychological distress, or basically stress, anxiety, and depression that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. So those are just some updates on how we're perceiving and diagnosing issues that come up for queer folks. So then I wanted to also look at youth at risk. And this one, I wanted to say, well, not all queer youth will have mental health challenges. Some, quite a few may not. Data indicates that they are often at greater risk. The Trevor Project has easily accessible and well-sourced data and statistics. They report that queer youth are more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their peers. In particular, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, and queer youth of color. It's important to be aware that the average age for coming out as queer is now 12 years old, making presentation for associated mental health concerns occur earlier in development than maybe what people might think. A 2017 Oregon Youth Council development report to the Oregon House Committee on Education reported the following statistics for Oregon youth. 7% of youth aged 12 to 17 identified as a sexual minority. 12% of 8th graders and 11.3% of 11th graders identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or questioning, and 2.3% of total students identified as another gender or transgender. It is likely that these numbers are way underreported for a variety of reasons. Oregon queer youth have increased risk factors that can contribute to increased mental health challenges. Those risk factors include more often being verbally and physically harassed, feeling unsafe at school, chronic absenteeism, hostile and unsupportive school environment, lower graduation rates, higher sexual assaults, and suicide attempts. So in further understanding the complexity of development, it's really essential to begin to understand identity exploration. And that is definitely something that I address when I'm providing services for youth. So to support the mental wellness of queer youth, it's helpful to understand identity exploration. Identity is a person's sense of self, both personally and socially, or the perception or collection of characteristics that define you. In social work, we strive to understand a person's intersectional identity. And this is the multiple identities and factors, including gender identity and expression, race, ethnicity, class, religious beliefs, sexual identity and expression that are unique to each person and may impact their sense of self and how they move in the world, experiencing both privilege and oppression. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson originated a psychosocial development theory that involved 8 stages of development throughout the lifespan. That includes like a conflict or a task that's supposed to be resolved during that stage. Erickson's theory describes the developmental stage during the ages of approximately 12 to 18 years old as a time when youth are experimenting with or developing identity or roles and experiencing sort of a psychological moratorium where teens are often put on hold a commitment to an identity while exploring options. Identity exploration and developing an understanding of self is part of it's a natural part of the developmental process and includes developing goals, values, and beliefs. This also includes the concepts of differentiation, and that's the process of becoming free from your family's processes, free to define yourself, and being able to have different opinions and values from your family members, but also being emotionally connected to them at the same time, as well as the concept of autonomy or the experience of acting from choice rather than feeling pressured to act in a particular way. This is considered a fundamental psychological need that predicts well-being. This also makes me curious then when I'm working with families too, for parents. The next question is, when does your child's identity exploration become challenging for you as a parent? As a parent of 4 kids myself, I know that no 2 youth engage in identity exploration in the same way. With my oldest son, I was largely unaware of the ingrained beliefs that I held and the norms from my extended family that impacted my interactions and expectations of my child and shaped my parenting approach. In working with families, I encourage parents to explore what is coming up for them as their child is wrestling with identity development. Often I found for myself and for parents I work with that the conflict lies with beliefs that are being challenged, as well as potentially being triggered by a parent's own unprocessed trauma or unresolved relationship ruptures. And fear and worry about the safety and belonging and acceptance of a child also frequently comes up as a source of deep-seated concern for parents. All of these are common challenges that families can work through with building skills to accept and face adversity and come up frequently during counseling. When left unresolved, it can contribute to relationship ruptures, confusion, and sometimes shame. So then we're moving on to talking about what we can do to support queer youth. And I would say often I talk with parents about validation, and it can be kind of confusing. And so I don't want to take it for granted that everybody understands what I mean, because I talk about this all day long, but I want to be really clear. Validation within therapy encourages and supports the understanding and acceptance of the client's experiences, both verbally and non-verbally. So often I talk with families about just reflecting back and acknowledging the feelings as valid that their youth are experiencing. It includes tolerance, active and attentive listening, reflecting without judgment, and just being with your child. Understanding ways in which gender is a social construct and fluid are important in validating your child's experience, as well as the differences between gender identity and sexual orientation, and how these may differ for your child compared to like heteronormative ideas. Understanding that coming out is personal and individual. That is really big, because I think oftentimes people might think of the coming out process as one and done, and it is not. If we can affirm, I want to affirm that anxiety, confusion, and doubt is a typical part of the developmental process of identity exploration. Everyone experiences this, and the more we normalize that for our youth, I think the better mental health outcomes we'll see. And if we can expose children to role models that can help them imagine different roles and options for their future selves can be incredibly valuable. Having conversations about your child's values, goals, and aspects of identity, as well as your own, is helpful in identity development and positive mental health outcomes. And just making sure to talk from your own experience in an open and non-judgmental way. And lastly, I would say advocate for your youth. And I will talk more about that in an upcoming slide. So then the next question becomes, I'm doing all of the things to support my queer youth. When do I need to get professional help? Importantly, I would say let your child guide the process and normalize mental wellness. Seek outpatient mental health services when your child asks for it. Some children will just ask and say, I want to go to counseling. Be observant of your child's typical behavior and communication style and notice significant changes. Signs of anxiety and depression for your child can include feeling down and hopeless, diminished pleasure in doing the things that were previously enjoyed, sleep disruption or sleeping more often, feeling tired or having little energy, poor appetite or overeating, negative statements or feelings about self, trouble concentrating, feeling on edge or irritable, not being able to stop worried thoughts, feeling as if something bad might happen, withdrawal and isolation, and or excessive worry over what others might think of them. These signs or symptoms may make it difficult for your child to engage in regular self-care activities or social interaction, may make it difficult for them to attend school regularly, and generally have an inability or refusal to engage in activities of daily living, as well as it may also contribute to increased family conflict. Queer youth are twice as likely to report depressive symptoms, and as previously noted, they're more at risk for suicidality. Directly asking your child if they plan to end their life can be intimidating, and research indicates it is the best way to prevent suicide attempts. Mental health therapists are trained and available to support the process of identifying, treating, and obtaining additional support for youth who are experiencing suicidal ideation. So back to this idea of how we can advocate for our queer child. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but here are some practical ways to advocate for your queer child. First off, this is really uncomfortable, but in social work, we talk about it often. Interrupt depression when you see or hear it, and engage in difficult conversations. Just knowing having difficult conversations are a part of life. This can take some getting used to, and in my experience, parents may sometimes avoid doing this for a variety of reasons. However, modeling doing this and having difficult conversations and interrupting oppression is a great modeling for your children, and it's powerful. And it can become easier by noticing when we may be avoiding doing it and maybe the underlying reasons why we're avoiding it. Learning nonviolent communication techniques and practicing using these skills will go a long way in making conversations with others productive and less defensive, more informative and compassionate. It's also important to understand power imbalances and how youth may have sexuality struggles or may have struggles advocating for themselves at school or in other environments, and they may need parent support to get their needs met. Better understanding the nature of gender and sexuality will help parents advocate for their youth and inform others. Lastly, I would say vote, get involved in your child's school and the school board, and use your privilege to elect leaders and policymakers who will protect the rights of queer youth and promote social change. Work to ensure that there are safe spaces for your child in their school to be with supportive adults and peers who identify similarly. Wow, that was a lot. Thank you so much for having me, and please know that I'm available if you have more questions or want more information.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It was really informative and helpful, and a lot of hard stuff to hear, but important to hear. And you said it in a very kind, but also clear way. So I wanted to keep listening. I wanted more. So thank you for that. I'd like to introduce our next two panelists. Our first panelist that I'm going to talk about is Chris Palomino, and they identify pronouns as they, them. They're a non-binary former educator, which I got the pleasure of working with in an early childhood program, which I loved. They currently work for the Trevor Project as a senior supervisor on the Trevor chat and Trevor text lines. At Trevor, Chris provides guidance, feedback, and emotional support, the counselors in conversations with suicidal LGBTQIA plus youth. They also lead special projects and develop guides to further ensure counselors are prepared and equipped to support our youth in getting the most comprehensive and valuable support possible. With that, I would like to give the floor to Chris.
Thank you so much, Victor, and everyone for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Nicole did such an incredible job of giving us this broad clinical lens, and I want to speak very personally, actually, on this subject. I came out as trans when I was 16 years old. I was at a boarding school. I called my mother, who was in Puerto Rico at the time with her sick mother, and told her that I was trans. So while I agree that everyone should come out when it's right for them, when it was right for me, maybe wasn't the right time for everyone else involved. My mom, in response to me saying that I was trans, said, "Oh, we knew that already." And I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" And she said, "That means you like boys and girls, right?" And so had to do a little bit of clarification there. And while I never came out to my parents as queer, evidently they were aware of the fact. And so that began a very long journey with both of my parents, who are incredibly and deeply supportive people, have always been. I'm very lucky to have supportive parents. I'm sure everyone who is here who is a parent is a supportive parent. That's why you're here. I knew from a very young age that my parents were accepting people. I wouldn't even use the word tolerant. I would use accepting, affirming. While we didn't talk about, I came out in 2013, so there wasn't as much conversation about gender at around that time. And so it wasn't really something that came up frequently in my family, but I was well aware that they were very accepting people. And so with that being said, I was more nervous for that than anything else that I've ever done in my life. It was absolutely terrifying. And I specifically came out to my mom knowing that she would tell my dad, so I didn't have to do it twice or with both of them. That was a choice that I made very intentionally, not because my father is any less accepting. He's just a little bit less of a conversationalist, and I knew he would get it once she shared it with him. I think in that moment, what I needed most from my mother was grace to still be figuring things out. I was young. I felt very certain in my identity at the time. I identified as a trans. I specifically said man, which was silly because I was 16, but I was very firm about being within the gender binary. And I think that largely had to do with the fact that I was in such an unaffirming of environment. My high school was very much rooted in archaic. It's an old institution founded in 1810, and it continued a lot of those traditions. So I lived in a girls' dorm. I had to very actively fight to be recognized for the person that I was. And so having my parents back me up was something that was kind of far away from me, but it was one of the most important things for me while I was trying to kind of fight those battles on my own on my campus. I think what I would have loved from my mom was more questions. She wasn't super in the know, evidently, and I would have been more than happy to answer questions for her. And I think that can vary from person to person, of course, but for me, what I was looking for was understanding. And so any kind of question that she had or has had over the past 10, 12 years, 11, 12 years, I'm not even sure anymore, we've had a lot of incredible conversations about gender, about my sexuality, about my relationship since then, as well as with my father. I feel like I leave him out a lot. He's not much of a conversationalist. But I think also one of the most incredible things that I have seen from my parents is advocacy, which, Nicole did a phenomenal job of touching on as well. My parents went to bat for me with family members, which is hard. That is not something that I expected to see. It's not necessarily something that I asked of them, but it was something that they did. And seeing that was more affirming than any conversation we could have had one-on-one, really. Even just months ago, my mother, who works in the court system, texted our family group chat and said that she had put her pronouns in her email signature and that already she had seen a bunch of others join in. And so from wanting to be there for me, from like sending me boys' shoes a couple of weeks after I came out to her, to doing things like adding her pronouns to her signature in her work email. My mom has like really demonstrated, and my father as well. They've both really demonstrated that they back me up. And even as my identity has shifted and changed, I now identify as non-binary. While my parents actually don't use they, them pronouns for me, that's something that we've talked about and we've established that I'm comfortable with. And I think just having that understanding, that advocacy, and that room and space for growth and understanding were some of the biggest things for me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. We're going to move to our next panelist. Ari is a parent and lives in the Boston area. Also is a college professor at one of the nearby colleges. He lives with his wife and 3 kiddos with varying degrees of neurospiciness. And we're so thrilled to have Ari back again this month to talk to us. So welcome, Ari.
Thank you, Victor. It's so wonderful to be here. And thank you, Chris and Nicole, for your amazing contributions. So I just want to say, so, I can, as I'm only going to be able to talk about being a parent from my perspective and what I've experienced so far. And my kids are 3, 3? No, 4. Sorry. I have 3 kids who are 4, 8, and 11. I get their names mixed up all the time. It's all going around in here. So 4, 8, and 11. And our oldest is non-binary, and so that, and most of our experiences have been with them. They use they them pronouns, going on this journey from they were assigned male at birth, and it's fascinating because I think just to give you a little brief sort of timeline, when they were 3, I'd say we started seeing some what's called gender nonconforming behavior and interests, where they loved Marvel Avengers things and also were extremely into princesses and started wearing dresses for like princess dresses for dressing up. And it wasn't until I think they were 6 or 7 that they actually one day just told us that they didn't feel like our oldest 2 were playing parents, and our middle daughter said, okay, I'll be the mom and you be the dad. And then our oldest came to us and said, oh, they were crying because they said they didn't feel like they were going to be a dad. They felt like a boy girl. And it was amazing because this was something that they had articulated by themselves, and it was not something we had gone on a process of accepting and supporting all of their interests and expressions, but hadn't been trying to lead them in any direction. And so it was amazing that they told us about that. And from that point on, we were working to start using they them pronouns. I'd say that took at least a year to start becoming fluid, and then maybe 2 to 3 before becoming perfect. And it's a process. And also we've had an amazing experience with our schools in terms of having teachers. Actually, so Victor was our kiddo's teacher, who was amazingly supportive and very calming and counseling to us. And when they started going to public school, it was we had a really wonderful experience where we let the school know, and the principal called my wife and I into her office, like literally on the first day, to say like, hey, let's talk about this bathroom thing, because as Chris was mentioning, living in a boarding school, but even in schools that are not boarding, they have a lot of gender things that are kind of needless. Like they'd line up the boys and the girls, and then they'd let one of each go to the bathroom at a time. And so we had a discussion about how that wasn't, necessary, because why? And everybody, we were able to work some things out. And so I just want to say that, just to preface this again, that we've had really wonderful experiences, very supportive from friends and my children's school. And but I'm sure this has to do partially, if not a lot, with the fact that we're straight and we are cis and we're white and where we live. So I just want to say that I'm sure, without a doubt, that this can be much, much harder. And I just I guess I wanted to just thinking about what as a parent, I think the most important thing you can do to support your child, and I really, this is so funny that Nicole mentioned this. I think for me, the most important thing is to sort out your own feelings about everything, because you may have 100 different feelings about it that may hold you back from really supporting them for who they are. And for example, it might be confusing. Does a 3 or 4-year-old really have feelings about gender? Are these feelings anything that should be taken seriously? I mean, they're 3, they're 4, or why are there so many trans and non-binary people now? Where were they when I was growing up, right? Or where were they in history? So that it may also be scary, if it's just a phase. Are you, by supporting them, declaring a different gender, does that set in stone something that maybe should be kept fluid? In terms of, if they say they're going to be an astronaut, I don't lock them in to working at NASA right now. You could have that kind of concern. What will my friends say? What will my parents say? Right. And, you may have had visions of your life as a parent that may become different in terms of everything that, sports, if you had colors for clothing, haircuts, all of these sorts of things. So I think that's the first thing is to sort out your own feelings about it. And as Nicole and Chris were saying, about learning about it is the most important thing, seeking out people who you can talk to about it. And I'd say just a second most important thing to do is to realize that nothing has to be done in one big step. I'd say, I mean, this is, I have a different perspective than some parents may have, in the sense that this came out in early childhood, as opposed to, let's say, having a teenager who comes out as gay and sort of like, boom, here's a fully formed person, or trans or something like that. But, I think I think it's probably true for that too, that you don't have to do anything overnight, right? You can learn about it in stages. You could watch a documentary, take out a book, talk to some people, and your child doesn't have to make changes overnight either, in terms of what they do. And I think the most, you can start by listening, by telling them that you believe them and that you support them. And, I think it's also okay even to say that this is maybe something that you don't know a lot about. So I told my kiddo that when I was growing up, I knew a lot of gay people, but I didn't know anybody who was trans or non-binary. And this was something that I was going to have to learn about. I felt like I was perhaps more ready to support them had they just been talking about being gay. But I think all of these things, you don't have to rush out and, tell everybody about new pronouns or, do everything. It can happen in stages as what's right for you and your family. So I think I'll just leave that right there for now.
Thank you so much, Ari. And thank you so much, Chris. The stories are so important to hear, personal stories of your experiences. And that's what people want to hear. That's what educators need to hear. That's what families need to hear. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Once again, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Ari. Like Victor said, very important information. And such great information as well. What we're going to do is something a little bit different than we normally did in the past with our programs. For today, we're going to do something what we call a fishbowl. And we're going to have our guest speakers, so Chris, Nicole, and Ari, kind of have a discussion amongst yourselves in regards to basically things that, that resonated with another speaker, or such as if you have any questions for each other, what, stood out. So Nicole, let me start with you. Is there anything or any questions you have for, Chris or Ari? We'll start there.
I wanted to go back to this idea of parents being able to have conversations with school administrators and teachers about where their child is at and what they're, and so I would love to hear more about your experiences, Chris, at boarding school in particular. And then Ari, you said that you had positive experiences, because I know the climate here in Central Oregon is maybe not as open to non-heteronormative ideas and how we can support youth, especially youth who are maybe identifying differently even in elementary school. So I'd love to hear more about that.
I mean, I definitely had a time. I will say I am someone who was pretty individualistic and outspoken growing up. It's how I ended up at boarding school by my choice. And I fought really hard, honestly. I got the name on my ID card changed. I had meetings with folks and said, like, this is where I'm at. And I did actually have the opportunity in my senior year to decide whether I wanted to live in a girls' dorm or a boys' dorm. I had a lot of conversations with the girls that I was living with that year about whether or not I was making them uncomfortable. That for me was my biggest thing, was, other people's comfort at that time. And so I chose to stick to a girls' dorm. It was working for me. I was a little scared of boys. And I think, like, for me, it was a lot of self-advocacy, really, a lot of just insistence. I went through a lot that year. My senior year, they did put one gender neutral bathroom in a building on campus. And then everyone was really mad about that once they realized that I would benefit from it, which was really interesting. And so I actually had a better time with the administration than I did with a lot of the students. So I would say for me, it was a lot of my own fight just because of the circumstance that I was in. But I would love to hear Ari's perspective on this.
And actually, well, could I just ask Chris, was when you were mentioning that about the students, do you think that was because, I mean, when you mentioned 2013, right, that was kind of, I mean, things were in the air, but it's not like where it's so prevalent right now, and do you think it's because of that, or do you think it was something particular to living at a boarding school where, like, if you're going to school and you're coming home at night, then maybe gender doesn't affect you and people in as deep a way as if you're, like, when you're living together or something?
That's a great question. I really honestly haven't thought about it much. I think the school was mired in some pretty deep systems of oppression across the board. It was very classist. It was pretty racist. I think being founded in 1810, a lot of the first families there were slave-owning families, and a lot of the students that I went to school with were legacy students, and they had been going there for generations. And so it was, I think, just an existing culture of the school. It was very regimented in terms of, like, we had very strict rules about girls visiting boys in their dorm room. It was like door open, 3 feet on the floor at all times, all lights on. And so I think it was a little bit of, like, those rules and that regulation, in addition to, like, folks' own families. I mean, it was, I think, a product of its time, and then also a product of the types of people that I was in school with.
Interesting. I just want to say that I think this is something that I think heartens me a lot, which is, I mean, oddly enough, which is that it's for better or for worse that culture can be really directed by the people on top in some ways. I mean, the people who, would say, let's just say, we're going to put in gender neutral bathrooms. That makes so much of a difference. Or people are starting to put pronouns in on Zoom. These sorts of things, I think, really make a difference. And so that the trouble is that's maybe not required, but certainly a large part of it. But at the same time, I think I've seen, just let's say at my own institution, I've just seen so many changes in terms of the way that the university operates, in terms of letting students in the student information system put in their pronouns, put in preferred names, working with them for diplomas and counseling them with how to deal with that, and so on. And so I think it's really interesting what you're saying about the culture. For our kids' school, I think, fortunately, so I think, as I mentioned, the principal had wanted to discuss about bathrooms. That was not, they allowed our child to use whichever one, and our child ended up kind of alternating depending upon the day. But the teachers, fortunately, we didn't have any trouble with teachers. I mean, I think some teachers, some staff have continued to have trouble with pronouns. It doesn't seem like it's something that is malicious, but that it's difficult, and that's there. But I think we, have an understanding in our family that this is something that can be tough, and trying to understand when it's important to, really make sure about something, and when it might be okay to kind of just move on from that. And I would have to say, very thankfully, the students have been very, very accepting. I mean, this was true even when they were in kindergarten. And I think at first I thought this would be a big issue, but, basically nobody bat an eye. And I know this has to do with where we live, but to a certain extent, I think kids are amazing. I mean, you tell a kid, it looks like the sun is going around the earth, but actually it's the other way around. It's this completely other way. And they're like, okay, I mean, so I think it's kind of like this kind of thing. You're like, okay, there's that kid is not, is a boy girl, as they put it. In one's afternoon club kind of thing, there was some, maybe not, I don't know that there was friction, but there was questions and maybe a little bit of something that became frictional. And one thing that helped was that we mentioned it, and one of the, I forget if it's the adjustment counselor or something, came to the after school club to just sort of talk about it. The other thing that I think can be really useful for schools is that, obviously this will depend upon where you are, but for example, in Massachusetts, there is an organization that can come to schools to help talk to administrators and teachers and inform them about these sorts of things. And so I think I would very much encourage anybody, even if you're living in a place that is very accepting, to think about that. Bringing it in. I'm sure it can't hurt for everybody to hear it again.
I love all the things that you're both saying. And then I'm curious about another piece, which is mental health. And I would love to know about the impact of the identity exploration and coming out on mental health for both you, Chris, and Ari, for your kiddo.
I'll be really honest. I have struggled with my mental health. I'll say since I was 13, but definitely before that as well. I have a number of diagnoses. I think it's a little hard for me to kind of decide what aspects of my mental health were affected by my identity and like the folks around me versus like my own disorders. I do think, though, I struggled a lot in high school with how gendered things were. I cried twice while you were speaking, Ari. Once when you spoke about your child even having the language to come out to you at such a young age. And then when you spoke about the administration, those are both really beautiful things. And I loved hearing that. So yeah, I think like just the change that I felt when I went from my high school to my college, which was, I went to Tufts. I specifically chose Tufts because my tour guide was non-binary. I like knew what I was doing. Before I even got there, I had an email that was like, we've changed your name in the system. You're going to live in a single, like you're going to be fine. We've got you. And it was really, really an incredible welcome to that school. And so my mental health changed significantly because I also was able to go on testosterone. That was huge. I still struggled with the disorders that I have, but there was just this heaviness that was alleviated by being able to be myself. And even more so when I came out as non-binary, it took me a really long time for that to sink in for me. And then working at a workplace where that is honored and affirmed, working with Victor, who honored and affirmed it every single day. Those are all experiences that I think have really helped me be or manage the other aspects of my mental health much better. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that. I don't have much to say about it because thankfully our kiddo is fine. I mean, also, I mean, we've done a lot of work, but it's also because they're also on the spectrum, and so actually most of the work that we've done with mental health professionals and occupational therapists and so on has been just around that's everything around that in terms of flexibility and emotion regulation and so on. They do see a therapist, and I don't exactly know what they talk about, but so I think that's there, And I just want to say this. So thank God. I mean, so thank God they're good. I do want to say that everybody. I know it's a cliche. Everybody's different, but it's so funny because I spoke to my kiddo this afternoon and saying like, what would you have as the most important advice? And they were like, the parents are like, and I was like, we have a Jewish big brother, big sister for them who's also non-binary. And I was like, well, do you think it was important to have somebody who is also, an adult who's non-binary who you can talk to? And they're like, they've never been huge. I mean, they own very much their identity, but every time we've gone to Pride, and so on, but every time we offer to do something, let's say like in a Jewish group that's particularly for LGBTQ people, they're like, I'm okay not going, so it's yeah, there's a spectrum of it is part of their identity, and yet it's not also so different, I guess, for them in that way. So that's just, I mean, that's not about mental health, but just to keep that in mind as differences also.
Thank you, guys. I mean, that was fantastic information. I'm learning a lot myself. What we're going to do is grab a couple questions, Q&A for a little while. I don't see any questions in our chat. So between me and Julie, we'll, I'll shoot you guys a couple questions. Julie, do you want to start or do you want me to go?
I'm happy to start because I have one that I experienced at school. What do you do? Because I run a classroom with, lots of queer kids in my room. What do you do when teachers consistently misgender students? And I'd love to hear from anyone who has a great answer for that, because I'm struggling with it as a teacher.
Well, I'll jump in because I love having awkward conversations. I actually really do. This is why I do this job, right? And I love helping people to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so I guess, Julie, what I would say is, practicing those like nonviolent communication techniques and really working on how we can approach people and have those difficult conversations and like raise awareness. Like, not, there's different ways that you can approach it depending on the relationship that you have with the teacher. But here, Oregon State has a campus where they work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and providing the training on helping people really understand their own bias and biases, and understanding that we don't have to be defensive around them. We all have them. It's becoming more aware of them and when they're negatively impacting someone else. So just like opening conversations, I would suggest like, hey, I'm noticing and that it's hard for you to remember the pronouns of this kiddo, and then normalizing that, like Ari said, how difficult it can be to make that a habit and something that you practice. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. So just like finding ways to approach people so that they're wanting to learn more and grow their own self-awareness and not becoming defensive. But I would encourage direct conversations about it when you feel comfortable. But I would love to hear what Chris and Ari think too.
Yeah, I don't like confrontation, and yet would also say I think conversation is the best way to go about it. I'm a big fan of asking why. If you seem like kind of have an understanding of like this is with malicious intent or it's not, if you don't have that understanding, asking like, hey, I've noticed that this seems a little tough for you, like what's going on there? But I think if you're noticing it's with malicious intent, I would feel ready to ask the question, or I would like to ask the question, like knowing that you might be making students uncomfortable and knowing that you're here to be teaching those same students, like how do you reconcile that in your day-to-day work here? I think that's a hard question to answer. And I think it requires a lot of thought and reflection. And I think really framing the students, their needs, and that's their role as a teacher to meet their students' needs might be a little provocative for them.
I like that a lot. I don't have much to add, but I do want to add one tiny little thing, which is that and this is, I think, what Chris and Nicole talked about, it really the central issues with this, but I want to talk about something that particularly with teachers that may be kind of like getting in the way when it's not malicious, which is, I think, teachers have concern for using English in the right way. And I know I've encountered some teachers, especially elementary school teachers, who say, isn't they plural? How can we use they to mean singular? And it's, just if that's the hang up, you can tell them it is that's absolutely fine. Everybody, this is what we do. You can say there's been versions of using you to mean a singular. I'm sorry, they to be a singular for hundreds of years, and language changes. And my personal favorite is that the main thing is that language changes, and that the pronoun you used to actually be, it only used to be plural. So you couldn't actually use the word you to refer to a single person. And now it's, of course, right, it would be ridiculous. You can only use the thee and thou, basically. And so if you're okay saying you to a single person, then you should, then you should accept language change in this way too. So I just feel like that might be something that sometimes that educators can get, hung up on for pedantic reasons.
Thank you. Those are all great answers. I really appreciate that. Nicole, I may be contacting you.
We still don't have any other questions in our chat. But another question that I have for our platform is, what is the best way to talk to your trans child or adolescent about safety? Safety seems like it's a big concern for trans children, adolescents, etc. So how do you talk to your child or talk to friends? Or Chris, how do you keep yourself safe, while you're at school or in public, etc.?
I feel very unsafe a lot of the time. I think especially right now, I'll be really honest, it's hard. It's hard to be trans. It's hard to do the work that I do, honestly. I think I am incredibly privileged in many ways. I pass for white pretty well. I pass as a cis man pretty well. And so in my day-to-day life, I'm not necessarily thinking like, oh, someone's going to clock me, I'm in danger. But I also have a lot of trans friends who don't necessarily have those privileges, and I'm very aware of that. And I honestly don't have an answer. I think right now is a really vitriolic time. There's a very loud, what I think is a minority that is really affecting the discourse and the language being used in a way that is so detrimental to our growth as a society, let alone like our own individual safeties and mental healths. And I know when I came out to my mom, Ari actually reminded me of this. My mother cried a lot and was very specifically like, I just want you to be happy and safe, and I'm worried. And I think that's a very valid concern. And I would love to hear other folks' thoughts on that, because I'm kind of stumped on that one, honestly.
Yeah, I think that comes up a lot when I'm doing family work, is the fear for their child's safety, and working through that and processing through that, and just being able to articulate it and put words to, what is coming up for parents. And I think you're right. There's no good answer for that, because we want to create awareness in kids, but we also don't want to create fear. So it's a very complicated dynamic there that there's, and no easy answer.
So just want to hop in a little bit on this too. This is just, thank you so much, because this conversation and that question is a painful question, but it's just, as someone who doesn't identify as trans, it reminds me of like all the small ways every single day that just around how do we convey kindness or safety just in tiny ways. And that just, I don't know, it just made me think of when you're all speaking, the things that can go unsaid or undone, but what would it be like if we said or did the things that conveyed safety or kindness more often? And voting.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to ask one more question if we can squeeze one more in. How about, I don't want to kind of be repetitive, but I'm curious about this one. What if you and your spouse are not on the same page? How do you handle that?
So I think that question is about coming out, right? Or managing.
Yeah, I should have clarified things. Yeah, it could be, your child's pronouns, gender, whatever, any of those, aspects. What if one parent's fully supportive and the other parent is kind of this is just a phase, right? And Nicole, I'm sure you've probably experienced some of that. I'm curious what you might think about that. And then, of course, everyone else can also speak up.
Well, I definitely don't have like all the experience in that regard, but I find that like a lot of times when parents come to counseling to support their queer youth, I think what happens is parents sometimes feel like they're being supportive, but they're more withdrawn. And like what Chris was saying, they're not asking questions, wanting more information. So they're like, oh, well, I'm supportive of you, but yet the youth isn't feeling supported. And so I feel like I get more of that than parents not being on the same page. And I think there's confusion by some parents on what support looks like. And it's not to say that there's not parents that, have differing views. I just don't, I haven't seen that come up as much from my experience, but I'd love to hear others.
I would love to speak specifically to the point of it's just a phase. I think that is something that I felt for a very long time. I think it's a large part of why I didn't come to terms with my gender identity until I did. I think my 5-year-old self knew a lot more and a lot better what I felt than I did when I was 16. And I think the key thing with it's just a phase is, what does it matter? If it is just a phase, shouldn't you, for this phase of your child's life, support them in the way that they're asking? And I think also there should be space for fluidity and for your child to change their mind. Like Ari said, your kid may say they want to be an astronaut and then not end up wanting to be an astronaut, but that doesn't mean you're going to sit there and be like, you're never going to be an astronaut, So that's my thoughts on that particular topic.
I just want to say very briefly that as a parent, it's the same, obviously you feel the same sort of thing in the questions. And I just want to point out that I've actually gone through this a second time, because my middle child, who is assigned female at birth, has been saying for about a year that they have he, him pronouns. And we, who have been so amazingly supportive of our oldest, were kind of resistant, because our oldest, like I said, had been gender nonconforming and so on from as early as they could have been. And our other one, our middle child, does not seem to be at all. But, so we kind of we're like, oh, is that seems like a phase or something about attention, being a middle child and so on. But then, about a month or two ago, I was like, it doesn't cost me anything, and it could be, and it's really important. And there's only thing that I'd be worried about is that other people saying, oh, they're just doing it for attention. But it doesn't, for me, that could be really important. I mean, that's what I care about. And so we ended up switching. And so I just want to really thank you, Chris, for emphasizing that point.
Thank you. Those were amazing answers. I really appreciate all that information, everyone.
Well, I think our time is coming to a close. What a remarkable evening. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Nicole. It's been an incredible conversation, so informative. And I just really hope that this was also nourishing for you as it was for us to hear your stories and just to get so much knowledge. And my sort of takeaway is to remind myself that people's lives are ever changing, and that that I think we're so quick to categorize and put labels on people, and that tonight it was a nice reminder to me that this is very fluid and it could change whether you're 4, whether you're 12, whether you're 80. You can change and your life can be different, and that's okay. So thank you all. I want to let people know that we have actually a raffle survey in the chat. We are thinking about next year's groups and how we want to have them, is particularly this particular series. And we want to get your feedback as parents and educators on what you want for next year. So please take this time to use the survey and respond to it so we know what to offer even next year. This series has been very successful this year. We want it to get even better. So please do that. And Megan, is there anything else that I need to do?
No, that's perfect. Just thank you so much to everyone who spoke. This is so generous, and everyone who's watching and sharing this video with other parents. Thank you for that as well.
Thank you all.
Have a good